I'm from the Department of Engineering Science, which is kind of the worst science if you think about it, because it's like science with a selection bias. So it's not really actually doing any sort of proper, real science. Well, hopefully we're not just doing engineering, but we're also asking why things work. And that's really mostly what I want to talk about today, is what is a problem of engineering a system that's going to be able to see. And so let's first talk about our visual world, just completely ignoring any sort of engineering problems involved with that. And to start, let's just kind of choose an organism at random. Let's choose a jellyfish. These are jellyfish. They light up. Why do they light up? Well, probably because visual communication is important in some sense. So I asked myself, can jellyfish see? And I went to the authority on this, which is apparently answers.com. And the first person says, yes, jellyfish have up to 32 eyes, called, I guess it's ocelli or ocelli, similar to vertebrate eyes, and can see shapes, distances, and colors. Some jellyfish have no eyes. And then the next person says, no, 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 that's actually completely wrong. They can't really see. They can detect light and dark. Seems maybe a bit more accurate, I'm not sure. And then the third person is very helpful and says, well, I can certainly say that the person that said that a jellyfish has 32 eyes is clearly wrong, but I do agree with the other person's argument. Well, this is the democracy of the internet. And then someone saw a National Geographic show, so we're getting closer to proper scientific sources here. And they said, okay, well, I've seen on this National Geographic show that jellyfish can navigate through some sort of mangrove, and they can avoid roots and things like that. And they can do this using some simple detectors. Okay. So let's ask what real science says. So of course we go to Wikipedia, and on Wikipedia we see that well, it's a kind of similar story. That jellyfish, they have a basic nervous system, and they do have these kind of rudimentary light-sensitive organs. And so we go further, and then we see, oh, there's no citation. But well, at least you can go to the other article, and then we end up with something that says eye and vertebrate in the McGraw-Hill Encyclopedia of Science and Technology. So that sounds plausible, not exactly solved. But it does seem true that simple sensors can lead to complex behaviors. So maybe even very simple sensing is vision in some sense. So we have other examples of this. There's the frog and the fly. If you take a frog and you have kind of a dot on a white background, and you move that dot around, the frog will actually stick out its tongue and try to catch the fly that's really just a black dot on a white background. If you haven't seen that, then you've certainly seen other examples of this. There's the cat and the computer mouse. If you wiggle a computer mouse, or if you shine a laser pointer on the floor, then a cat will actually try to bat that and catch that. Or there's the moth and the flame, which you have these very simple, well, even in the case of a cat, it's quite complex, but nevertheless fooled by very simple visual stimulus. And then there's the mammalian eye. This varies from organism to organism, but more or less has the same structure. We've got a lens. We've got some sort of, let's call it a CCD array at the other side that's going to collect this light and turn it into electrical signals. So what's really different about the human visual system from all these other organisms? Well, it's the wetware. We've got a much more complicated set of processing going on. This is actually an engineering view of what the human brain is going on. Don't attribute it to me. It's from USC, and they clearly think that the kind of visual processing that's going on in computer vision systems is exactly analogous to the brain. I might disagree, but nevertheless, a very large proportion of the brain is devoted to vision. Some people estimate over 50%. I'm not going to argue. There's probably people in the room here who know better than I. And it has some sort of semi-reasonable bandwidth, a bit like a modem, perhaps. But of course, we have attention that will saccade to different regions of the scene. And so we can do some very efficient compression in that way. And then we have complex feedback loops from our higher functions, our higher brain functions, that allow us to reason about visual stimulus. And so the cartoon version of the brain, which is more or less my level of understanding of it, is that we get light that goes into the eye. It goes to this little bit in the middle, the LGN, and that then projects back to the visual cortex. And that's going to do some basic visual processing. And it goes into two main streams, the dorsal stream on the top and the ventral stream on the bottom. And so we've got kind of different types of visual processing going on in these different streams. Broadly speaking, there's kind of localization, navigation in one stream, and more detection and recognition kinds of things in the other. And I would say that, at least in my own personal research, I've been more interested in this detection and recognition, although I recognize people from my lab who are more interested in the other. And human brains are really big. I mean, they're kind of amazingly, unprecedentedly big. And we pay a cost for this. We pay an energy cost to feed this giant machine. But really, there must be some sort of reason why we're paying this cost to have these brains. And a huge proportion of those brains are really devoted to vision. So vision's a really big, important problem. And it's important to be able to see well and understand visual stimulus to function in a complex world. So here's our world. It's amazingly complex. There's so much going on here. We have predators and prey. We have complex interactions between predators and prey. You have this schooling behavior that's evolved basically to stymie the visual system of this predator fish. And we have other examples where we have this kind of conflict between predator and prey that's evolved these complex optical illusions. This is really just trying to hack a lion's visual system and fool it. And we have other reasons why vision is difficult. In this scene here, we actually have clouds in part of this and snow in the other part. And we can all distinguish this in this room. But if you actually took this completely out of context and just saw kind of through a straw a little patch of snow and a little patch of clouds, you wouldn't really be able to distinguish those two things. And we can see things that are invisible. If I ask you a question, is this man committing suicide? You'll all be able to answer no. And that's a very complex process that led to that answer, but you can do it in a split second. And can we eat these mushrooms, of course? And I think that vision is more than just inverting some sort of light function. You know, we're not just trying to take some projective geometry and invert that. The number of interreflections going on in this wave are just too massively complex to ever hope to really invert that. But nevertheless, we all have a pretty clear model of what that physical structure of that wave is, where that person is in relation to that wave, why that person is standing on water, and what all of these physical processes are going on that interrelate all these things. And we're not doing this purely based on some sort of physics inversion problem. We're really having some sort of model of the world, and we're doing visual pattern recognition to be able to index that. And then there's organisms that you've probably never seen before. This is a tarsier, but somehow you have a visual analog of what this is to other organisms that you may have seen before. So you know that those are eyes, you know that those are hands. If you're a biologist, you probably can even figure out just from this picture what that organism eats. It eats insects. It has these hands that reach out and grab locusts or other kinds of insects. And we can reason a lot about different types of environments. And then things change. We actually engineer our own environment visually, and we do so in very complex ways. And human environments have very different statistics from natural environments. So we even complicate our visual world further on purpose. And more importantly than having different visual statistics, the semantics have completely changed. So we need to have a completely different notion of new categories of what there is in the world. We need to have vocabulary for a chair and a lamp and a ceiling and a window, which we wouldn't have to have otherwise. And we have just amazing environments that result from these processes. And we engineer our visual environment in many ways for many reasons. We do so for communication. It could just be a byproduct of a design or manufacturing process. We do it for decoration. We make maps. We have iconography that gives us a symbol that represents something much deeper, potentially. We do this for artistic expression. And then on top of all that, we have many different imaging technologies that we're employing. So we have microscopic imaging, telescopic imaging, non-visible wavelengths, and penetrating rays. So we have written language. We have woven tapestries. We have a technology that's designed to look like a human hand. It's certainly not designed for function. It's designed for our analog to what we see and recognize as being human. We have maps that can be annotated automatically with useful information. We can have more schematic maps. This is the Zurich tram system. And we have icons. All of these things should represent something to you if marketers have done their job correct, right? And there's nicer icons as well. And we have face painting. We have kabuki theater, where we've taken that person and massively modified their appearance. Now this is a person. We semantically recognize this as a person, but the appearance is completely different. And somehow this is striking and visually appealing to us. And we have more effective visual optical illusions. And then, of course, we have different kinds of imaging technology. This is a type of pollen. And here's some plankton, and plankton at a different resolution. These things are extremely important to be able to categorize and understand automatically in terms of environmental science and all sorts of other things. So these are problems we'd like to be able to solve. We have scanning electron microscopes, telescopes, thermal imaging, fMRI, X-ray. So with all of this complexity in the world, and the world is fundamentally visually complex. I mean, that's why brains have grown so big. The question is there any hope that we could ever build effective artificial vision systems? I mean, we really would like computers to be functioning agents in our visual world, whatever that means. And that's going to necessarily have to solve some vision problems in order for that to really be the case, that we can send machines out in the world and have them interact in a meaningful way. And computers are ultimately going to be judged on their comparison with us, with our abilities. But we actually, we're really able. We have very large brains that have been optimized by evolution over a geologic timescale. That's a really difficult thing to compete with. And the world is massively diverse. So there's been several strategies that people employ to make this a more tractable problem. One is that we can restrict the domain, of course. So this is kind of computer vision circa 1985. And what they would do is they would employ in factories, you would have these little kind of dots with a cross on it. That's something that's a very distinctive visual pattern, and so you can track the movement of that head during a crash. You have these camera systems where you have exactly calibrated cameras above a conveyor belt, and you have this robotic arm that's supposed to take these parts and arrange them or do some sort of quality control with them. And actually, this has been highly successful in a number of domains, this restricting the domain strategy. So MNIST it's posed as a supervised learning problem. So we have a training set of 60,000 examples of digits, handwritten digits, and a test set of 10,000 examples. And in this case, the digits have been pre-segmented and centered using some automated algorithm. And as a result of this, virtually all checks that you would write are automatically processed. So they're just scanned in. The number is read off of the digits that you write. I'm not quite sure how it is in Britain. In the United States, at least, you have to also write out in longhand the number. And so these two numbers are both estimated independently, checked against each other. And usually that's enough to disambiguate any sort of errors that may be made in any of the individual subsystems. And then we can actually solve the problem of check processing. So this has extended the life of checks by probably a couple decades, but ultimately they'll probably go away. And there's other domains that are kind of similarly simple, fundamentally simple. So this is just results of a Google search for portrait. Somehow Watson and Crick showed up, and nearly everybody is white. But that's the result that you get. And so this is also somehow a limited domain. And so there's another strategy that we can use, which is to use statistics to represent the variation in images, right? So this is just the mean of those previous images that we've seen, right? And you can already recognize just from this mean that this is a face. This is kind of a portrait category. It's not just a face, but it's a face in a specific pose. I think you can even still recognize that there was an American flag behind Obama. And then that's usually not enough just to represent the mean, so you also want to have some estimate of the variance of how faces vary across a population. Okay. So another strategy that we're going to use is to use semantic labels to train a statistical classifier. So if you know anything about regression, then this will be essentially what the problem is. So machine learning is a regression from an input space of images, X, to some output space, Y. Now what that Y is depends on what task it is that you want to solve. So eigenfaces, which is kind of this variance of faces that I showed on the previous screen, you want to estimate something in RD. Classification, you want to come up with some sort of binary label that says either something is present or isn't present. Regression might be take a picture of a fish, what's the weight of the fish? These kinds of things. And there's many other potential output spaces that you could have. And actually this is really, these output spaces that are listed here are the ones that have been studied in classical statistics, not necessarily the ones that we need to solve the problems that we care about in vision. And so I just want to talk a little bit about supervised and unsupervised learning and what those problems are. So unsupervised learning, we're just given a set of images, let's say n images. Now, supervised learning, we have that set of n images with some sort of annotation, y. And that annotation can either be complete or incomplete, depending on whether it's fully supervised and semi-supervised. And ultimately, what we care about is that integral on the bottom. So that integral is the integral over the joint probability of images and those labels of some loss function L. So that's the loss that we're fundamentally going to pay for making a mistake. Now what that is, that depends on the task. And in the case of humans, that's kind of been optimized by evolution, right? So the loss function is, ultimately, is your vision system good enough to transmit your genes to the next generation? But in the case of artificial visual systems, at least currently what we've done is we've defined this explicitly and said, if I make a single mistake on a classification, I'm going to pay a penalty of 1. Or you can say, if you have some sort of marine science monitoring program, you can say, well, maybe certain organisms are actually the really key organisms. And if I misclassify one of those, I'm going to pay a high penalty. And if I misclassify something else, I'll pay a lower penalty. And we don't have access to this distribution P of xy. So we have to estimate it from the data somehow. And if we assume that we can get training samples that are drawn identically, independently and identically distributed, IID, then we can approximate that by some summation over a finite set of samples. And that's almost always what's done. And I want to make a point also about Bayes optimal classifiers. And that is that any classification system will necessarily, almost always, have some sort of error to it. And that error is sometimes unavoidable. Now, if these plots here are of class conditional probability distributions, let's say you have a bunch of fish, you have a bunch of cod, and you have a bunch of haddock, and you want to distinguish these things. And the only measurement you have access to is what's the weight of the fish. Let's say that the weight is plotted along the x-axis. Now, if you know that one fish is heavier than the other, then how difficult this problem is will depend on how similar the weights of those fish are naturally, right? So on the, I guess this is your left, there is something that has a high confusion. There's a very high overlap. And ultimately, the expected error that you're going to pay is this kind of gray area that's under both curves. But if the curves are more separate, then the expected error is going to be much lower because you have a much lower area under the curves. But almost always, that number is non-zero. And furthermore, it's unknown. So we can't know how good a system is necessarily. And now let's look at some real problems. Well, some toy problems that computer vision people consider to be real problems. So here's a kind of a state-of-the-art data set. It's a bunch of annotated examples. We've got 20 different classes. It's actually a relatively small number of classes. And there's a few thousand images. I think maybe by now, including training and testing and validation, it's up to tens of thousands, perhaps. At any rate, we have a bunch of semantic categories, and someone has very painstakingly and very time-consumingly gone in and drawn a box around every single one of these objects. And so there's 10 other categories that I haven't shown here. And just to show that it's state-of-the-art, it's just been published this last year. So the question is, how well can we really do from a few thousand annotated images? So what they've done is that they've actually run a competition, and we can be quite sure, at least in this case, that there's less selection bias than you might usually find in computer vision literature, because people have had to submit the results before they know what the actual result would be. And so we find that some categories are easier than others, with a few thousand images of training, of course. And this is kind of this average precision is some sort of measure of how accurate it is. If the average precision is 100%, then it's really a perfect classifier. And if the average precision is 0, then it gets everything wrong. It says that things that aren't members of the class are, and vice versa. And so the max is about 93%, so getting fairly close to perfect, at least on this data set. And the minimum is 53%, which is pretty bad. And if we actually look at these, the results, just to get a kind of a snapshot of the state of the art, where do people do well? Well, they do well when there's an airplane against a clear background. And they do poorly. These are the things that kind of mistakes are made. Well, you've got a little toy airplane that's in a background that you're not expecting to see. You don't usually have an airplane in a cornfield. And so it's really using a lot of context. And then if we look at the mistakes that it's made, well, it mistakes mostly birds for airplanes. In one case, it has kind of this advanced racing boat or a woman in underwear. So that's kind of a view of the state of the art. That's what we can do today. But I think that we can do better. And I'm hoping that we can do better. And let's see why maybe we can. So an image is a very high-dimensional thing. You know, even if you have 640 by 480 pixels, that's quite high-dimensional if you just take that as a vector. But underneath this, there's really a geometry that makes this much simpler. Now, as a thought experiment, presume that you could actually have a camera at any orientation, any focal length, anywhere in space-time that you want. Now, if we were to move that camera by a little bit, then the image wouldn't change very much. So this is exactly the structure of something like a Riemannian manifold. And so if we look at what are the parameters of that space-time, the position, orientation, and focal length of the camera, well, that's essentially 8 dimensions. So we know somehow that these data, even though they're extremely high-dimensional complex data, are on at most something like an 8-dimensional connected manifold. So ultimately, this problem should somehow have a simpler structure to it. We should be able to do something better if we can exploit those statistical regularities and find those statistical regularities. And not only is that the case that it should be on a low-dimensional manifold, but that manifold should actually connect back to itself. Because there will be people at different points in space-time who will be eating around a table, or there will be many identical chairs positioned throughout space-time, etc. And so this problem really is kind of, there is a statistical structure to it that should be simpler. So my view, in some sense, is that computer vision is the process of inferring semantic structures in the world from this manifold of images. Now, the manifold is extremely complex. Make no mistake. I hope I impressed that on you in the beginning of the talk. But it also has exploitable statistical regularities. And so this is a cartoon view of what this manifold might be like. And every black dot is going to be an image that we have sampled from this manifold. Now, if we have enough images, then we've kind of sampled densely, and we can more or less reconstruct the structure of the manifold. If we don't have enough images, then there will be complex structure in that manifold that we won't actually capture, and there's no hope that we would ever be able to generalize to something on that part of the manifold. Now, computer vision has been largely reductionist. It's said, let's take just a portion of that manifold and really model that only locally. So let's only care about cars or only care about faces and do that just one task at a time. And let's only do that in a very simple way, which is to either classify these things or do a 3D reconstruction just locally. So that buys tractability, but I think we've really lost something important in that. Because what we really want is a functioning agent that's going to go out into a complex world and really be able to interact in a meaningful way, and not just be in some sort of restricted environment like a factory. So one way that we're going to deal with this is try to find more meaningful statistical tasks. So machine learning for computer vision, as I said before, it treats the problem as a regression. So it's a regression from X to Y. Now, we can't change X. We're stuck with the images. That's kind of necessary for it to be considered a computer vision problem. But if we have this function f that maps from X to Y, well, there's two other variables there. There's f and there's y. So what can we do about those? So we can change the class of functions f, and we can use different types of nonlinear functions, and that might better fit the local properties of the manifold. And if we really modify that function class, then maybe we'll do better. This has been the thrust of computer vision almost for the past 2 decades. It's been saying, let's take some sort of classifier. I mean, a couple decades ago, people were using artificial neural networks almost exclusively. Then somehow support vector machines came along. And there's Gaussian process classifiers, there's deep belief networks. There's all sorts of technologies that have been used. But ultimately, people have been playing around with this function class. Even people who have been doing feature engineering essentially are just engineering a different class of functions. The other thing that we can play around with, which has been exploited somewhat less, is the output space. What output space are we going to regress to? So instead of just using standard off-the-shelf statistical tools that say, I can do a binary classification or I can do a scalar regression, what we really want is to optimize the actual behavior of interest, which is to say, maybe I want to infer 3D structure in the scene, or maybe I want to determine where things are and their interrelationships. Maybe these are more the questions that we want to ask. And so we want to put that into a statistical framework to do that, and we're beginning to do so. And I think that this is going, in part, to move us closer to the original problem that we had, which is designing functioning agents, not just designing something that can say, is there an airplane in this image or not? So different kinds of spaces that we've been trying to work with are object detection, in which case we often call this detection as predicting a bounding box around objects of interest. We have segmentation, where we'd like to have a mask that indicates pixels that belong to certain objects. And we can also have something like object or scene layout, where we have sets of related detections. So what this image here is showing is actually a task in a benchmark competition, where you're supposed to not only predict that there's a person, but you're supposed to predict that there's a head there, that there's hands here, and that there's feet there. And somehow this is supposed to be a proxy for really saying that you can understand something about the structure of the person and its interrelationships between its parts. Another theme is that we're going to have more data. We have billions of images on Flickr. We have a day of video uploaded every minute on YouTube. and we have terabytes of porn. This is what's out on the internet. So that might be enough data to learn the structure of the manifold. So that's pretty exciting. But there's a caveat from statistical learning theory, which says that nearest neighbor classifiers are universally consistent. So if all you want to do is have some sort of classifier that is going to be correct more or less every time, well, universally consistent means that with enough data, it will converge to the Bayes rate, which is that underlying error rate that you cannot improve upon. So then all we have to do is actually collect every single possible visual stimulus in the world, and then just say, oh, I've seen this before. Go search through the database. Maybe I come back a year later and say, this is the visual stimulus that you saw. There's a plane there, or something like this. But this is rote learning. And we don't want to do this. We want to actually be able to come up with a simpler, more compressed representation of the world that's going to be more useful, faster, and actually generalized to things that we haven't seen before. So what we need to do is we need to limit the classifier capacity. So that's a fundamental requirement of any sort of reasonable approach to learning and all this data. It's no longer going to be Bayes optimal, so we get a little frowny face. But overall, I think that this is actually probably a positive. And we need to free the beast. We don't want to rely on this guy to sit there putting bounding boxes around every single object in every single image in the world. So if this is our bottleneck, and in some ways, okay, it's not really like this. We have grad students who actually do it. I'm not sure if anyone in this room has ever spent any time labeling images, but you can also do this with Amazon Mechanical Turk. And if you're a big company, I've visited companies and kind of found out about what they've done. They'll remain nameless, but people generally have kind of image labeling sweatshops in China or other places where they literally they'll employ people to sit for some large number of hours per day and doing fairly menial tasks of saying, is this pornography, is this not pornography, or, show me all of the cars in this image, label every single pixel of where a car is. And this is a bottleneck. There's vast data sets. Corporations are compiling vast data sets that are able to do this. And so in some sense, just bootstrapping the human brain is kind of enough. We're bootstrapping the human visual system. And we'll get a long way that way. But if we ever want to kind of have machines that can learn on their own, that's not going to work. So what would computers do without nerds to tell them what to do? Well, not much. Yet. So maybe another way of approaching this would be more something in a reinforcement learning type perspective, where you have some sort of delayed feedback. Now this feedback could come from people, but it could also come from a performance on some sort of proxy task. And what that is, I really couldn't say. I think there's a lot of candidates for what we might want to do. We might want to have something that goes into a robotic environment or into some sort of controlled environment and interact with something that we know well and say, how well do you perform on that? Of course, that raises a question of why not just train on that data originally. So this is a bit of a tricky question. And well, ultimately, what will computers do without nerds to tell them what to do? Well, it depends. It depends on what tasks we actually set for them to do and how we evaluate those tasks. And we really, if we're going to take that approach, need to make sure that it's optimizing things that are of value to us. And we need to at least have some control over that process. Okay, so thanks.